Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Henney, Artistic Director of Theater Dybbuk, and it's such a pleasure to be with you this week. Uh, these are conversations and talks I do every other week here on Theater Dybbuk's page about our work with our collaborators, about art in general. And this week, it's really my pleasure to be here in conversation with an official artist of Theater Dybbuk, an amazing dramaturg, Dylan Southard. Dylan, thanks for being with me.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so glad to take this time. We see each other across these interwebs, but it's nice to do it publicly.
Yeah,
Um,
no kidding.
so before we dive in, I just want to give some framing for those who are watching about kind of who you are and our work together, and then we'll proceed from there.
Cool.
So as I said, for those just joining us, Aaron Henney, Artistic Director of Theater Dybbuk, and I'm here in conversation with Dylan Southard. And Dylan is an official artist with Theater Dybbuk. He's our dramaturg. And Dylan will probably explain a little bit more about dramaturgy, but to give you a brief, kind of how that works with us is that really means he is our primary script consultant, for lack of a better phrase, meaning he is asking the hard questions about the script. He's asking story questions. He's making sure that we are staying on track with trying to be true to what the play or performance work is trying to accomplish. And he is both, therefore, inside and outside. I mean, that's kind of when I do dramaturgy, that's how I think about it. I'm both inside it, but I'm also providing a kind of neutral view from the outside. And uh, Dylan and I have worked together for years, for a very long time. Dylan actually has dramaturged every one of Theater Dybbuk's work, with the exception of one, which was where we started, and then you came on board. But it's been quite a long time. And in addition, we also worked together in other forms. I mean, we both taught for the Roby Theater Company, and that's how we first met, and have had a couple other chances to collaborate. So Dylan's really a good friend and colleague, and we've developed a long relationship over a decade or more. So it's really a pleasure to be with you. And uh, rather than me
Decade
giving,
plus. Wow.
I know, rather than me giving the kind of all your details and bios, I always prefer to
Yeah.
ask my guests to sort of share a little bit about themselves and their history and how they came the work they do. So if you wouldn't mind, like, tell us a little bit about your work in dramaturgy and maybe a little of your history and how you developed this career.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I was a pretty standard theater kid back in the day. I've been, doing theater, since I was a kid and teenager, and started at like how, I did a bunch of acting just because that's where the opportunities you have when you were as a kid. But pretty early on, I was pretty interested in the other realms of theater, other ends of theater, other parts of the sort of creative process. And so was had a little theater company with friends in high school that we did shows in the Bay Area when we were growing up, and so producing our own shows and like trying to adapt things. And when I was in college, I was studying theater, but I was also studying Italian, so I was doing a lot of like translations and a lot of sort of thinking about. I say that like I was doing a lot of like dramaturgy before I knew what dramaturgy was, just because of sort of where my interests were tending to go in the overall theatrical creative process. It was always ending towards the sort of like script element, kind of playwriting, but also, what does it mean to actually take a piece of writing and interpret it and turn it into something else? And, actually, how does that process work from a, like kind of an academic standpoint and a kind of historical standpoint? So I was doing dramaturgy before I knew what dramaturgy was. And then, I was getting out of college, and I knew I wanted to work in theater, but I definitely at that point was like, I don't want to be an actor and I don't want to go to grad school. I'm kind of done with school. So, I was encouraged to apply for these internships at like regional theaters. That seemed like a real, the way to go. And that's kind of where I actually learned about dramaturgy, was looking at all these theaters and those internships that were offered in literary departments or in the dramaturgy department of a regional theater. The description of those jobs was like, oh, that's the kind of stuff I like to do. I like to read scripts. I'd had an internship at a film production company when I was in college, so I'd read scripts there. I kind of, because of family friends, I had like, you know, people who worked in Hollywood who would give me scripts when I was a kid for movies that hadn't come out yet. So I kind of had a few, like I was always really into that kind of stuff. And so I applied for that, got a dramaturgy internship at Center Stage in Baltimore, spent 2 years there. And that's really where I like cut my teeth as a dramaturg, really learned what it was really lucky to be at a theater that like really valued its dramaturgs, had, I was one of 4 people in the literary department, which is, 3 more than usual at a theater company. So it was a pretty like robust crew that had also been sort of empowered by the artistic director to do a lot of stuff and have their hands in a lot of things. And so really fell in love with it then. Finished up at Center Stage, moved to LA, and have been doing dramaturgy and dramaturgy related theater activities ever since.
Cool. I find interesting, when you were talking about dramaturgy and kind of that you were doing it already, and then wound up, kind of finding how it was official.
Mm-hmm.
That just to frame for people before we dive into some other things, kind of, I said one version of what dramaturgy is, but what's really interesting, of course, is that there's different kinds of dramaturgy, right? There's the dramaturgy of script development in the way that we often work together, which is asking questions of the script and the ways in which it's operating. There's also dramaturgy that's also often research dramaturgy. That's about kind of providing historical context, which of course sometimes crosses lines with script development because they're interrelated. Mm-hmm. But do you tend to exist in both ways, where you're doing research and providing that context as more traditional script consulting, or do you find that you tend to live in one area or more?
I definitely do both, and I definitely enjoy doing both. I think if you sort of, wait it out, I do more new script development, just because, one, I enjoy it a little bit more, not to say that I don't enjoy doing the research and really diving into things. And as you say, the more you do both, the more you realize they're kind of interconnected. And, in both cases, you're talking about where plays come from, and you're kind of trying to find the source of a play, whether it be inside the playwright's mind as they're writing it, or in the history that surrounds the writing of the play. In both cases, you're trying to sort of get at the same thing. But yeah, I definitely do more new play development. And I think that's also, a function of sort of how theater has evolved, and that the research end of stuff, frankly, it's gotten a lot easier to do research in the last, 20 years. And research is a lot more available. And so, it's a little bit, those jobs aren't as readily available, but also I think there's a sort of more robust new play development kind of pipeline or process that has continued to evolve. And I really like being a part of that. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I remember in my early days of dramaturgy myself, I remember going to the library and getting the 30 books and poring over them.
Me too.
And now it's just a different thing because, the writer may not, or the director may not have had the bandwidth to do that. So I was there to provide that. But now, because anyone can go online and access so much, you're right, it's a much different experience.
Let me tell you though, there is still to this day, I hate to be like the old man, but there is still some benefit to going to the library. There are still things in the library that are not on the internet. And if you're actually interested in, for all you dramaturgs out there, if you're actually interested in real research, you should still go to the library. Believe you me.
I totally agree. Also, I myself just got, a few books that I needed for research that I wanted to do some deep dives, and the work that's in the library is especially useful for that. So I agree.
And I also, when it comes to the research, my philosophy about it now is that my job, and this is also how I kind of find some fun in it, is to sort of research things that aren't readily obvious as the things to research, right? To look one, because there's if you're producing a play it's set in 1925 London, it's okay, we know what to look for, and I don't need to tell you actors what you need to research in order to whatever, but it's the sort of the next level of connective things. And I'm doing research into 1925 London, and I see a reference to something that maybe isn't immediately apparently connected to the play. But if I sort of go down that rabbit hole a little bit, maybe I can build my own kind of connection. Sure. And in that way, research becomes its own kind of interpretive act. And so it's a little bit of the dramaturg getting to I mean, it's still ultimately up to the director to decide whether they're interested in this stuff or not, but you can use research to kind of, make a statement about sort of how the play feels to you.
I love that because, of course, there's an infinite amount of material out there about a given time, especially about certain times.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are weaving together a narrative when you present research. You are saying, this is the narrative of this time that I think speaks to what the play is up to. And
Exactly.
if you wove a different, quilt of research, the message might be different. So that's really interesting. And I think that's good for people to process, that research is not merely about regurgitating facts. It is about weaving together different facts to present a story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the best
Great.
kind of dramaturgical research is that kind of level.
So talk to me a little bit more about your work in dramaturgy, of what does that look like in with different companies and different, kind of what is the landscape for you at this moment?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad landscape. I mean, that's sort of the trick of dramaturgy. The like the running joke of dramaturgy is that nobody quite knows how to define it, or that, everybody sort of has a vague, like, yeah, I know what dramaturgy is. Kind of like, do you? And that goes for dramaturgs themselves. Like, we're as guilty as anyone of being unable to actually like provide a succinct definition of the job. But part of the trick is that it is so broad, and it does really depend on the situation and who you're working for, and when you're entering the process, and what relationship you have with the people you're working with, whether it's a new relationship, whether it's one like ours that's like been going on for a decade, so it's almost always dependent. You're almost always taking your cues from your opposing party, right? From the person that you're sort of supposed to collaborate with, whether it be the playwright or the director. By and large, those are the two. Either you're going to be working primarily with the playwright, or you're going to be working primarily with the director. And in both cases, you're really taking your cues from what they're going to need from you. So, in some cases with a playwright, it is just being like, their editor to some degree, somebody they can talk to, somebody who knows what they're after and what they're trying to do and what their intentions are.
Dylan, you froze.
Oh no! Am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay,
you're back.
I'm moving locations.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm so glad you're back.
I'm going to be poorly lit now, or less well lit, but I think I'm closer to my internet now.
Okay, great. Okay. I'm glad you're with us. That was exciting. I love the live experience.
All right, where'd you lose me?
You were talking about the nature of dramaturgy and the landscape at the moment, and you were kind of, so just dive back in, we'll find our way.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think what I was saying was it's so dependent on sort of, what I'm doing and what the definition of the job is at any given point is so dependent on what my opposing party, be it the playwright or the director, sort of needs from me at any given point. So, in some cases, if I'm, in a situation like ours where we've worked together for a number of years, we know one another, the relationship and the job is like an editor, right? And I'm talking things through with you. I know I have a good sense of where you want to be going. And so I can help you kind of get there by asking the right questions, by knowing the ways to push your buttons and pull your strings and that kind of thing. And that, is often the case when you're talking or working with a playwright that you've worked with before, and you're starting in early on the process and you're sort of there the whole time. If you're sort of brought in a little bit later in the process, and the theater company itself is bringing you in, oftentimes it's much more about framing the play for the audience, right? So that's where you get into the program notes that you might write, or in some cases where you're sort of consulting with whoever's doing the marketing, whoever's doing the publicity, talking about how this play is going to be framed to the audience and what kind of sort of position we're taking on this play. And that particularly applies with plays that are classics or that were well known. And what is our angle on this? What is our approach? How are we talking about this play that may or may not be different from the hundreds of other productions of it that have come, later or before.
Right.
And then if you're working primarily with a director, yeah, that might be a case where I'm doing more research, or I'm sort of, because they're going to be relying upon that research to help contextualize their interpretive choices and the choices that they're going to make. So I might be doing that, but again, if I'm working with a director that I have a pre-existing relationship with, a kind of like similar relationship to one I might have with say you, like I've worked with this director many times, then they might treat me much the same way that a playwright would, which is like, hey, I need a fresh set of eyes. Hey, I know that you know where I want this to be going. And so can you watch this and tell me if that's in fact what's happening? Because, and that's what you were saying about the outsider insider thing. Like the thing that I think separates dramaturgs from anyone else in the production is that their responsibility is to keep a certain distance from the production, right? Whereas everybody else, their job is to get as close emotionally to it, as they possibly can, right? That's their job. But the side effect of that is they may lose some perspective. And, the smart directors and playwrights know that that's the case. And so whether or not they have a dramaturg officially designated or not, they're going to have somebody who's like, hey, I need, that they can turn to say, hey, I need a fresh set of eyes. I need an outsider's perspective. So it's one of those things where I say, like, there's a lot of dramaturgy going on, even when there's not a dramaturg who's officially like present there as the dramaturg.
So that gets me thinking about our work together, because you mentioned that role, and so I'm curious if you can share a little bit about the particulars of working with Theater Dybbuk, right? Which is a particular for those watching, and I've discussed this before, but we develop work over a long period of time, a series of script development meetings that are largely dramaturgical in nature, in that we are talking about a script and all parties are kind of giving their input, and I'm processing that input and bringing in new pages. So there's kind of a group dramaturgy process happening. But then on top of that, you are playing an outsider insider role, but then on top are sort of the most outsider insider, in that you are trying to hold a space of that for everyone. And so I'm curious about your experience, how it maybe is like other processes you've been in, and also how it's different.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's pretty different in that exactly what you say. There is a group dramaturgy that is happening, and that I find that my job often with Theater Dybbuk is to sort of try to collate the group dramaturgy. And so it's and sometimes, and I hate to admit this, but like sometimes to be the like bad cop in the room, or to be the strict teacher, and who's like, okay, we've had this conversation multiple times where I'm like, okay, like we've gotten a lot of opinions on a lot of things, but it's now time for you, Aaron Henney, to go write your play that's going to say by Aaron Henney on it, and to sort of, so that's a sort of example of like that. I mean, that is the real like bad cop example. But even when it's about, collating, condensing, editing down, sort of coming up with the nugget that everybody in the group dramaturgy is circling around, and sort of getting it down to like, okay, if we had to sum up what's going on, here's what it is, because otherwise it becomes an awful lot for you to manage as a playwright, where you've got, a lot of different people and a lot of different opinions. And that's wonderful. And it creates a really interesting kind of play and a really interesting kind of process. But part of that process, I think, is the times where you say, okay, we need to get the 10 streams of information and opinion and emotion down into one, so that you can now proceed as the writer of this play. So it's sort of, it's, I guess it's not like quite the opposite, but I would certainly say it's a very different kind of process than otherwise.
What's fascinating that I've experienced with you is that often, because our pieces deal with, you know, issues in society, questions of assimilation and identity and justice and power, that our group discussions can sometimes veer away from the actual dramaturgy of the play. They can become discussions that are about societal forces, about contemporary society versus society in another time, about all of these things that all feed the play but are not the play.
Right.
And often I feel like your role sometimes, especially with me, yes, with the group, but with me, is to say that's all really interesting, and what how is the play operating,
Right.
like, and I think it's a really good dialogue to have between the group wanting to process the kind of what is it about, the big why, and you're there to partially say the what, like, it's okay, we can feed that why, but what are we doing that is going to feed that why? And I
Yeah.
think and I think that's why it's so important to have you in the room, right? Because some people who may not be familiar with this kind of process might say, you already have so many voices, why is each voice needed, not you in particular, but each voice? And
Mhm.
I think, you know, each person's bringing a different perspective, and the perspective you're bringing is about sticking close to the operation of the play, so that
Mhm.
we don't just get bogged down in the larger questions, because plays live in the details.
Yeah, yeah, I would totally agree, and I think that's specific and particular to Theater Dybbuk, but also, you know, somewhat consistent with dramaturgy as a whole. You know, because converse, whether it's happening in the way that it happens with Dybbuk Productions, where it's, you know, it's over a long period of time and several of these conversations, or if it's just table work, right? And it's just that process of you know, yeah, always keeping the conversation tethered to the structure of the play. And okay, this play has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it has cause and effect, and it has the audience is going to perceive this play in a particular way because it is a story that is being told, and audiences receive and perceive stories in particular ways, and they try to make meaning out of stories in particular ways. And whether or not, you know, this play, any play that I'm working on, abides by that, or is just sort of aware of that, or was rebelling against that, sort of being aware of it, and it in being in conversation with that, you know, that part of the experience of seeing a play, you know, I think is pretty important. Or as a dramaturg, you know, I kind of that's the part of the play making experience that I'm supposed to champion and you know, advocate for.
Right. So you have a unique biography in that, and you touched on some of it at the beginning, but that in addition to your work as a dramaturg and working in a variety of places, and you've taught playwriting, you've taught dramaturgy in a few settings, and you also were the co-artist at one point of a theater company, and so I'm just curious about how these different experiences, you know, from teaching to co-leading a company to being a dramaturg to very early on being involved in theater in other forms, how that has informed your work and your thinking. How does that influence the choices you make and maybe the notes you do give to people?
Well, you know, it's a thing about it goes back to what we were talking about, being sort of an outsider and being, you know, as much sometimes also a dramaturg is supposed to be kind of like the surrogate audience member. You know what I mean? Like the person who can be, yeah, again, somebody who's walking in with a sort of with an objective, not having dedicated their lives or committed their emotions to the play, and sort of receiving it that way. And I think all of these various sort of jobs I've had have given me a bunch of different perspectives on theater and theater's relationship to society, like where theater exists in the world and how people think about theater, and, you know, being able to then channel that back into actually making a play and saying, okay, you know, I understand what story you're wanting to tell and what emotions you're trying to communicate and everything that's going on. Let's also think about, you know, that this play is going to be going out into the world, and that audience members are going to be walking into this play having entered from the world. And there's all sorts of preconceived notions and perceptions. And if it's, you know, running a theater company, as you well know, like, it's about sometimes like writing grant narratives and framing theater in a particular way, about, you know, meeting a social good, or, you know, sort of how does theater work, and what does theater contribute to society? Like, you have to think about it that way. If you're talking about, sometimes when I'm teaching with people who, they have a bunch of different opinions about theater, and they have a bunch of different intentions for their plays, and not all of them want to get produced on Broadway, and not all of them are trying to write a play so that they can like get hired on a TV show or whatever. You know what I mean? Some of them are writing a play for very personal reasons. Some of them are writing plays that are just for them. And to understand that they have a different relationship towards theater, they want different things from it. They're looking for, a different kind of experience from it. I think just the appeal of dramaturgy always for me is like, you get to do the most. Like, you get to have your hands in the most things. You get to like poke around in the most ends of it. And so going out and like, running a theater company, teaching theater, producing theater, producing weird quasi theater things, like all of that, is sort of towards the same spirit and energy of like, knowing theater from all angles and being able to talk about theater from all angles, or as many as I can.
I mean, I think back to, I think one of the reasons I operate the way I do as a theater artist, similarly, is, I mean, I think back to the gift we're given when we go to school for theater, which is in, I won't say all, but many schools and universities, you are doing all things. You're learning how to build the set. You're learning how to work in the booth. You're learning how to act on stage. Again, different programs, not every program operates that way, but many do. And I think the value is that it offers entry points to every aspect and understanding that. And I appreciate what you said about, dramaturgy being a profession of that you are saying, what I'm the expert in is being of service to all the ways this play means and all the way this play operates. And I think that that's a really unique position to be in. I want to pivot away for a second from the particulars of your theatrical work and talk about another aspect of your career. So you have done some a fair amount of work in virtual reality, which I suppose we are all living in at the moment, in some form.
Some would argue this is just a virtual reality.
Yeah. So just share with us about it, because I find it such a fascinating aspect to your career, and it certainly intersects with theater, and I'm sure some of the lessons you learned in theater come into play in your work there, but just talk to us a little bit about your work there.
So I mean, it kind of came about as an extension of theater. I mean, I got involved with people who I was doing theater with, and particularly doing like immersive and interact, like we had started to kind of fool around with that. And I think, that's a really interesting intersection of theater and virtual reality, is immersive theater and interactive stuff. And so we were starting to fool around with that. And, this was in like 2014 when there was a real opportunity. Like, that's when, Oculus came to be and really hit the scene. And so there was a lot of, there was an opportunity to sort of like, there were no experts, and so if you could kind of make a case for why you could be the expert, you're the expert. And I think that was, applying my dramaturgical thinking. The thing that was really exciting at that point was that, it was basically an entirely new storytelling medium, right? Like, it was the dawn of, not to get too grandiose about it, but it was like, you don't have that many opportunities as somebody who's interested in story. And this was one where it's like, this is an entirely new medium. So somebody's going to have to establish what works and what doesn't. And it was pretty clear that people who had experience in theater would be best suited to do that, given the connections, and given that from the standpoint of the audience member, the experience of seeing a play, the experience of being inside a virtual reality experience, the closest parallel was seeing a play. And the closest parallel was really seeing an immersive play, was seeing Sleep No More or whatever. But even just a play, because you could not, the makers of it, the audience members could decide what they were looking at any given time, right? And in a film, you don't do that. Like, you cut from shot to shot, and so it's, now we're going to look at this, and now we're going to look at that, and now you're looking at this, and now you're looking at that. In theater, you don't do that. They can always look at whatever part of the stage they want to look at, and so you have there's the way in which you guide an audience's attention is much more nuanced and complex and interesting, frankly. And it was really getting interesting once immersive theater was coming to be, because that was a real challenge. And that was the preeminent challenge of VR, was how can you tell a linear story when you can't be sure that an audience is seeing the thing you need them to see at any given point. And so that's why the powers that be of VR were kind of interested in theater makers, because it seemed like they might have the best answers to that question. And so that's what, we got to do, early on. At this point now, things have kind of settled into what they are, and VR kind of knows what it is. And it, it exists. It has its sort of strong, where it succeeds and where it doesn't. But especially in like 2015, 2016, it was kind of like, somebody tell us how best to use this, right. Because, we don't know. Hold on, I'm going to shift my hold.
I love it. Live, so exciting. It's really interesting for those who, many watching are probably familiar with immersive theater, but just to say, for those who may not be as familiar, so immersive theater is often what it means is you're having an experience where you are walking through or moving through something that is changing. There's often a kind of choose your own adventure aspect to it, that you can engage in ways you choose, that it's surrounding you as opposed to just being presented in front of you. Every project has a slightly different relationship to that, but I'm just giving some basic parameters. So it's interesting to think about how that is the sort of lived version of what a lot of virtual reality is, which is if you look to the left, you're having one experience. If you look to the right, you're having another. And so then questions of storytelling come up. And I think about, you mentioned Sleep No More, which is one of the kind of biggest hits of immersive theater that was in New York. And my experience with it was, I remember recognizing that there were people having a completely different experience of the work, and that it meant that that presentation's relationship to story was about shards. It wasn't about linearity. It was about, I'm catching pieces of things and I am putting together an emotional experience, but not necessarily a narrative one. And it's interesting
there are so many people, writers and directors, who were absolutely terrified at that notion, that was how this was going to be perceived, like through shards, and like to give up that amount of control and to kind of like throw your hands in the air and be like, they're going to get what they're going to get from this. And I am not going to be able to present a cause and effect kind of thing that's eventually going to get to a meaning. That was and still is like very terrifying to a lot of people, both in theater and in VR. So so oftentimes it was about showing them how an experience could be impactful, even if the audience wasn't going to always go from A to B to C to D, and sort of reframing the entire conversation about, well, there are other ways in which an audience can feel something other than by getting this sort of cause and effect story of like, oh my God, he did this, and so he became that, and so that led to this, and that's why I'm supposed to be sad or angry or whatever. Like it, the first step in VR was always to when we were talking to like clients who were interested in, paying for it to make a VR experience, was to say to them like, that's not how it's going to work here. And if you're trying to do that, the only way you're going to do that in VR is by basically denying everything that's fun about VR. There would be these ideas of like, well, we'll have arrows that'll point them towards the direction they're supposed to look at, or we'll make sure that everybody in the experience looks in that direction at the right time, and then the audience will know to look in that direction. And we would always say like, well, that defeats the entire purpose of VR. Like the point is you have freedom. You script your own experience. Like you make your own story. So if you are the creators, you are going to have to come to terms with that being the relationship you have with your audience. And you are going to have to rethink what it is you are contributing and how it is that you are, starting them on that journey, whatever the journey might be. And so it was a tough go of it, but frankly, theater artists were always the most up for it, because theater is also the most sort of flexible and like, whatever, we'll break the rules, who cares, versus film, where it was, people who were coming out of the film world it was very hard for them to sort of understand that and be okay with sort of breaking down, like really breaking it, like tearing it down to the studs and rebuild and saying like, we have to start from an entirely different standpoint, you know?
So interesting. So I can't help but think of, I was laughing internally when, it's like way back in 2015, 16 at the dawn, that
A
we're,
long time ago in the VR world, let me tell you.
isn't that amazing? Right. And it gets me thinking about where we are now and how we're also in this moment of investigating or reinvestigating how we work, and when there's new challenges and new opportunities and all of that. So I'm curious about, in these last few minutes, what does this mean? What is this moment, all that's going on and all the ways that means? What does that mean for you and your work and how you're operating and what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's hard. It's, it sounds terrible to like say it's like, well, it's an exciting time. I mean, it's not, obviously. The amount of theater that's been lost, the amount of people that have lost their jobs, the amount of like art that is not going to exist because of this is catastrophic. If you're sort of looking at like, okay, let's look at the future of theater. I think you're right. Like there is, when I am able to get excited about it, it's by thinking of this as an entirely new medium that we can create, and that in some ways, like in VR, a lot of people were contributing, but theater people were invited in, and that's rare. That the skills of a theater person are sort of extended to, you felt that they're necessary in other industries. But this is another one where it's like, it can be us theater people that decide what this new medium looks like and how it functions. And so in that way, I think it's really exciting. And the more that this situation sort of requires us to like tear everything down to the studs and rebuild it, the more I think we're going to benefit from that. I mean, the whole notion of like what people were freaking out about, like, well, we can't, how are we gonna have theater? Nobody can sit in a house together and sit in an audience and watch theater. And the response was like, well, whoever said we needed a building to do theater in? Like, if you sort of like get it down to that level, and really start to think about what it is that defines theater. And even if we say like, okay, then this is not theater that we're doing, it's something else entirely, but who cares? That's just a name that we're applying to it anyway. We're all a bunch of artists. We should take advantage of the opportunity that we have, whatever they may be. And if we're creating a whole new thing, then, even better, we're creating a whole new thing. So that's how it's sort of positive. I certainly think, for that's sort of on the pandemic side of things. If we're talking about everything that has been going on politically and racially, and particularly in the theater world, that's definitely been cause for me to have to reappraise, some things that I think about sort of my value to a production and my value as a dramaturg, and even just the notion of objectivity. I mean, I think that's been the real mind bender for me, because that's how a dramaturg kind of justifies their job, right? Is like, okay, they're the ones who maintain an objective viewpoint of things. Like they're the ones who say there are things about plays that work and don't work no matter what. Like there are ways in which you can get to an audience, right? And it doesn't matter what the content is. If you do it like this, it's going to work. And that's supposed to be objective. And if you're sort of saying, well, what has been determined to be objectively good or bad was made by a bunch of landowning white men, like then it's not objective. And what is objectivity in theater anymore? And does it exist? And if it doesn't, then how does the dramaturg have to, reframe his or her position, within the production world? And that's honestly still a question that I'm, wrestling with. But I think it's obviously a question that has to be addressed.
Thanks. I think that's a good place to sort of bring us to a close, because I love the idea of ending with this question that what is going on in our society is encouraging us to ask these questions that go beyond the moment and are about all the moments and are about the positions we inhabit, and do the positions or the way in which we fill them have to change. And I think this is a really good place to kind of leave us sitting with. So before we go, One is I just want to thank you for the time. It's always just a pleasure to hear you and catch up and to
My pleasure.
learn more about what you're doing. I even found out some new things today. So I like to close out always though with is there a place where if people do want to sort of get to know more about your work or what you're up to currently? Is there anywhere they should go? Anywhere they should check out?
Hey, yeah, hey, I got a website. Go for it. DylanSouthard.com. Check it out.
Awesome.
It's filled with fun and information.
Dylan, such a pleasure. And I want to say to those watching, I mean, on a personal level, that it is remarkable when you have collaborators you get to work with for this length of time. And I think this is something that doesn't always get talked about a lot, that, you know, more than a decade of work together, there's a deep understanding. You know how to push me and how to ask the right questions that allow me in. I can be honest with you about where I'm at. And that allows work to continue. And the value of ensemble, which is essentially we are in an ensemble together, allows us to build meaningful things. And I'm grateful for that long relationship. So thanks, Dylan.
Thank you.
A pleasure. See you real soon. Everyone, see you back in 2 weeks and take care. And for those who celebrate, I hope you have a good holiday. And just for everyone, I hope it's a time of as much safety and health as possible. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, Dylan, and take care. Bye-bye.